Hey, good morning, all. Welcome to the Common Good Podcast. Pretty special day today. Tripp Fuller and Tony Jones on the podcast. What a great day. Hey, January 3rd, everybody. And that means it's Ruben's birthday today and John Raymond's birthday. So happy
Have you been to
birthday, John
OPH
Raymond.
yet?
Going to 1045, buddy. Going to 1045.
I went there yesterday with my oldest kid, and he had 49er flapjacks.
Wow. Tony and I live within miles of each other, have exactly the same birthday life with children, adult children. Take them to the original Pancake house and enjoy some pancakes.
Ironically, it's not the original Pancake house. That's in Portland, Oregon. So I don't know. It's one of those funny ironies.
When I was in Amsterdam, there was a place like on the block of Anne Frank's house that was called the original Pancake house. And it was old. It was older than America.
Head on over, have a conversation about resistance to Holocaust, and grab some flapjacks. We get them blueberries. Hey, guys, you might not know that we often begin this podcast with how's the weather where you are. So outside, I haven't been outside yet today, Tony. Maybe you have. It's cloudy where we live, and feels just perfectly winter out there. Just January.
The sun is actually supposed to come out later today, Doug.
All right.
Which would be the first time in several days. Yeah.
Tripp, how about you? How's the weather over there?
Well, in Greensboro, North Carolina, it's 40 degrees, partly cloudy with a high of 51 today. The sun might be peeking out in the early afternoon. And next week you're going to be here, Doug, and I'm going to be in your hometown.
Isn't that funny?
So,
yeah.
We're going to rotate.
In fact, for people who care, what we're going to be talking about today is this emerged podcast you guys put together. Tripp, you will be sitting in this very room that I'm in right now while we stream from right here. Yeah, and then I will that night drive to your town. We'll make that swap. All right. Hey, people might already know Tripp Fuller, Tony Jones. There's a chance of that, but there's also a chance people don't yet know you. And what you do. And this whole conversation about emerging church, if people are in the Common Good podcast stream, the Vote Common Good ecosystem, they may know nothing at all about emerging church stuff and what that all means. But you two have sought to rectify that for people by putting together a really well-produced and riveting podcast called Emerged. And I've only listened to one episode because I think only one episode is available for the commoner in the world.
Well, I wouldn't call you a commoner, Doug. You're on the picture of the first episode. Like there's a little cartoon of you, much younger, but not as handsome.
Thank you. Yeah, and that's the thing we should talk about, that I'm a part of the storyline of that, because the emerging church was something that a bunch of us, including Tony and I, spent a lot of our lives working on, and then soon met Tripp Fuller, and a bunch of us worked in that area and space. And then a lot of people found it just kind of went away. It sort of, I don't know, it was like we didn't know we were making sand art at the time, but all of a sudden it was gone. Or, as they say in the trailer to the podcast, or did it go away? Ooh. All right. So Tony, remind people what you do, because if they look you up now, they're going to find out that you're a world-class hunter. You're obviously a writer. You have a PhD, but you're also connected to this emerging church world. So remind people of the pedigree of Tony Jones.
The pedigree. Well, Doug, I grew up not far from where you are sitting. I grew up somewhere between you and me right now, where the two of us are sitting is my home, where my 80-year-old mother still lives. And just met with a handyman there a couple days ago. We're going to put in some extra handrails for her to try to keep her in that house a little bit longer. Wow. Grew up around here. Went away to school a few times, but always ended up back in Minnesota. And I had a long career in church ministry, seminary education, publishing, Christian publishing, and things like that. And those, I think are still, I guess, part of my, I don't know, how would you say it? part of the road I walked to get where I am today. Today, yeah, I'm still involved in some kind of stuff like that. I'm really less involved in the church world, and I spend a lot of time outdoors. I do a lot of writing about the outdoors and guide trips in the Boundary Waters. Yeah, I have a new book coming out in April on kind of my journey out of the church and into the woods. And then always have little side hustles going. So one that I think probably Ryan Burge and I should come back on your podcast in a year after we've done the largest ever survey of nuns, non-religious affiliated Americans. So we have a big grant from the Templeton Foundation, and that's just gotten underway
Wow.
in the last few months. So that's
Super
a 3-year,
interested in that. Great.
yeah, a 3-year project, and how non-religiously affiliated Americans find meaning. We call them nuns, Nones. Although when you're not writing that out, it can be confusing. I'm sure you've talked about that on this podcast before.
Yeah, I've got all kinds of thoughts about that, what that means, and why affiliation is the primary means by which people think Christianity is identified. So I think really be super interesting.
Yeah, so
right.
that's one of my side hustles, and then another one is this project with Tripp that kind of blossomed out of his brain, and then we got to talking about it. It's had various iterations and has become something that we just launched 2 days ago, and it's been super fun. Even got an email from one Shelly Pagitt last night telling me how much she liked the episode.
She was emotional. I walked in the kitchen.
Is that right?
She was emotional. She's quick to emotion, especially the crying kind. But she was very touched by all of it. As was I. I listened to the first episode, and it was real flashback kind of moments. When Brad Cecil's voice came on, my heart just sort of started pittering. But I checked the EKG on my watch, and it was all fine. It wasn't a medical emergency. It was just an emotion that I was having that I'm not used to. Hey, Tony, you may look just like a average pheasant hunter, but inside that brain of yours is the payoff of Dartmouth education, Ivy League college educated, in Princeton seminary, and doctoral degrees. So you bring a significant pedigree to a conversation about church history, and you were a practitioner in this emerging church world. In fact, the executive director of probably one of the more significant organizations in the emerging church movement, Emergent Village. So you're an insider to that world, making a podcast about the very world that you were an insider to. So I want to come back and ask you about that, how that feels now. Tripp, you also may just look like a average pheasant hunter, but I don't know if you kill animals yourself at all. Do you? Are you an animal hunter?
I like eating hunted animals.
Sure.
More of a fisherman. Now, you forgot to mention that Tony is also one of the leading roadkill chefs. We
right.
didn't mention that, but yes, hunting. But also, what happens if you just come across turkey? Recently had its life ended by automobile, and it's frozen. He cooks it.
And you are not kidding. On the podcast we did a week ago, which was a podcast about the podcast that now we're having a podcast about.
Yeah, very meta.
Tony told us about the turkey that he had on the smoker that he discovered on the side of the road and picked up, brought home, cooked it up, made it look great. And I'm assuming
I had
Tony
a thought.
ate it.
First, I had a thought because it was frozen solid when I picked it up on the side of the road.
Yeah, and then he sniffed it.
Well, I sniffed it as it was thawing because believe it or not, like evolution has built into us certain ways to suss out, rancid meat. Yeah. And human beings can't digest rancid meat. A lot of other mammals, frankly, can digest rancid meat. We cannot. So I've sniffed it, and that's I don't know how else you're going to tell if something's rancid other than sniffing it.
Yeah,
Doug,
or
did you know that you had a friend?
Don't eat the dead animals you find on the side of the road. Has been my tact. But maybe I should start using my nose.
Somebody's going to eat them. Some animal's
Look
going
at
to eat them.
look at Tony's nose. That is a sus sniffer right there. Sus sniffer, Tony Jones.
I do feel badly for those people with long COVID who lost their sense of smell but like to eat roadkill because they're really up a creek.
It's really sad. That might explain the increased frequency of frozen turkeys on the side of the road. Though, Doug, emergepodcast.com. That's where you'd go if you were interested in that podcast, where I can guarantee you there's zero discussion of how to cook frozen roadkill. It's not there.
Here's a question from Kimberly. Can fish get rancid? Is that the same thing, or do they
look? Let's just put it this way, Doug. Any meat can get rancid.
A fish made out of meat? That was poultry. Okay. Hey, Tripp, you also have a pedigree in this area. You're a professor. You're a writer. You're one of the more exceptional and well-received podcasters in the world of Christianity and Christian thought in America. Remind people, if they don't yet know, what your background and pedigree is.
Well, I grew up a church planter's kid, and then was always into reading theology and philosophy from like middle school on. So went to undergrad, did philosophy, religion, and theater as my major, and then went to divinity school at Wake Forest University, did a PhD in a joint PhD in philosophy and religion at Claremont Graduate University in LA, and then was in LA for 10 years or so, and then spent 3 years doing science and religion stuff at the University of Edinburgh, and then last year moved back here to the States. So that's kind of what I've been up to. And I do the Homebrewed Christianity podcast, which has been going on for almost 16 years now. So
you were early on in podcasting. You created the Homebrewed Christianity podcast and have kept it going for 16 years. There are not very many people who have a 16-year run in podcasting. Some people have a 16-episode run or a 16-week run, but 16 years is not something a lot of people can put on their sleeve of honor.
And Doug, this is, I mean, I know I don't want to start your day off on a sour note, Doug. Okay, but I know you have a lot of missed opportunities in your life, like one.com. But you and I started the first Emergent Village podcast before Tripp started Homebrewed Christianity. We recorded, because Florin Paladie just sent it to me. We recorded it at a restaurant you no longer frequent. It's called Chipotle. Wow. On York Avenue in Edina. We sat outside and recorded the first Emergent Village podcast. We could have had a similarly long run, but we quit. There are 92 episodes total of the Emergent Village podcast. You and I are on episode number 1.
What year was that? Do you know?
And I will tell you. Maybe you can. Simon Cheese Danish was sitting at the table with us, starting his 1-month internship with you.
Yeah, I cannot remember that. I remember that. I remember Simon from Denmark.
Denmark.
When we talked about Danishes. Yeah, Danishes. He said, we don't actually eat those in Denmark. That's an American creation. That's not even Danish.
I don't know what year. I mean, maybe that would have been 03 or 04 or something like that. I mean, it was anyway.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean,
maybe
I remember somewhere in 04, 06, I left blogging because I thought it was too negative and wanted to get into blog talk radio. So Tripp, like you, been noodling around in this area, but you have maintained one consistent podcast. Others of us have bounced around to many a platform in many ways. And Homebrewed Christianity is not just a single podcast. It really now is a podcast
empire.
Yeah, empire. Gotta be fair. Like I bring that up because this particular multi-episode podcast that is a duration to it emerged, the oral history of the emerging church, is produced by Homebrewed Christianity. Does Homebrewed Christianity have other podcasts that it also has its fingers in? And are you producing more like the This American Life of American Christian thought?
Over the years, I've done a bunch of different podcasts. We had one called the Lectio Cast where we went through the lectionary. And after 3 years, you've done the whole thing, you know. But then there was a Culture Cast, Theology Nerd Throwdown. Like, there's been a bunch of different ones
Okay.
over time. The last 4 years, I've been doing classes where instead of having multiple podcast feeds, I would do the things that would end up on different podcasts all on one feed, then do classes from like ones on Bonhoeffer to one on like science and religion stuff to like doing ones during Lent or Advent, things like that, where you'll get 2,000 to 4,000 people in these classes. And that was really where the idea for this came from. Is Tony and I were hanging out, and I thought we should do a class like what did we learn in the emerging church movement, and do like where are they now, and have different friends on, and slowly the class morphed into well let's produce it, weave it all together, and that kind of thing. And so this is really the first time doing a podcast with this production level, mostly because I hate editing. I don't, and I used to do it a lot. Tony would send me critical comments. Why is it over 45 minutes? And things like that.
That was just Tripp's intro to an episode would be over 45 minutes. A
Well,
lot
we're
like it reminded me of the announcement time at Solomon's Porch. I think these people need an editor.
No,
that would be a jab at Doug Pagitt. That is the congregation they were both.
Well, that's a whole theory of like using all the extra space and then land in the moment, right? Tripp, there's a whole trick to that. It's the whole you were early Joe Rogan on long form, even though that guy.
And like even this past year, the top 10 episodes, the top 10 episodes of Homebrewed, 7 of them are 2 hours. Yeah, or more.
Look, I almost don't. I don't subscribe to podcast feeds that are less than 45 minutes, usually less than an hour. Not worth my time. I'm not doing snippets. I'm not the TikTok generation. Don't need that.
You're not a TikTok generation. You're not.
All right. Okay. So this podcast, Tripp, as you mentioned, is well produced, and I don't just mean the background music and the actual production style, even though its quality is right up there. Very well compressed and very well leveled. So whoever's doing the leveling and the compressing, it sounded extremely consistent.
Josh Gilbert. Josh Gilbert's his name.
Well done, Josh. I mean produced in the sense that you've taken many conversations, dozens of interviews, I'm guessing maybe more than that, of people talking about a period of time, 20 years, 25, 30 years in the past, and woven those together into a consistent story at least in the first episode, and I'm guessing that's going to happen in the subsequent episodes. So the level of commitment to do this, to set up interviews, to ask people to talk with you for hours, to excerpt portions of those interviews, that's a really high level of commitment, right? I don't just mean like, somebody's got to edit them and it takes a long time, but just the desire to storyboard an oral history is a really big deal. Like, we don't do that around here. A podcast on this thing goes from this live feed, within minutes we're done, export audio and put on the website, put in the podcast feed. We don't edit at all. Nothing. 2 really different styles. So Tony, I'd love to hear from you. Why did you think this was worth this level of work? And then Tripp, maybe you also want to add in why. What do you think the benefit of doing this kind of, I don't know, this American Life sort of storytelling narrative form was important? So Tony, why did you feel like the oral history of the emerging church was worth all of this effort and all of this work, as it became clear to you that this is going to be some work?
Well, I think I didn't know exactly how much work it would be going into it. When we came up with this idea, like Tripp said, he thought, let's do a class. A class would be pretty easy. We'd do a little bit of research, and then we'd, have you on one week, and we'd have Brian on another week, and we'd have, that kind of thing. And I do that all the time. Just like both of you, I have I have a podcast where I interview people for between 45 and 60 minutes. All my producer on that podcast does is take out the coughs and the throat clearings and somebody clicking their pen in the background or whatever. But otherwise it just goes out pretty much as is. Yeah, exactly. Like that. That drives my podcaster. My producer on that podcast has a little speech he gives at the beginning of each interview, and he talks about clicking pens. So I didn't know what I didn't know, which is probably wise, because I don't know that I would have done it had I known the amount of time. For me, I'm in this funny, and Doug, you've been there many times. Tripp's been there a couple times. I'm in this funny no man's land moment of my life where I've got a book complete and I'm waiting for it to come out. And I'm hoping, and you never know, that it comes out April 2nd and maybe my life gets really busy, maybe people want to talk to me and have me speak and, whatever. Maybe not. It may just be crickets, but I won't know that till April 2nd. So I kind of had this gap, and my part of that Templeton grant doesn't start really for another year. So I had this gap in my life where I was like, I can take on a big project right now. And then I just thought there are little things that you can do in a highly produced podcast like we're doing that you can't do in just a long form interview. So for instance, the number of people who have said to me, oh my God, when I heard Phyllis Tickle's voice in the trailer, I was just like, that just caught me in my, like you with Brad Cecil. Courtney last night, my wife, Courtney, we were talking about it, and I was a little bit like, my God, do you know how much time we spent on episode 1? And we have like 9 or 10 more of these to do. That it was an extraordinary amount of work to do one episode. Now, hopefully our learning curve is that we'll get better at it and we'll be more efficient, but it was really hard. We went through so many iterations of that episode, and she was getting a little misty hearing Ryan Sharp's voice singing songs.
Wow.
Like that brought her back to a moment in her life, some of the music in the background of that episode. And that's why. So I just want to say, like, that's why, because we can not just interview you and Brian McLaren and Nadia Boltz-Weber, but we can also find archival audio from Phyllis Tickle and the music that, I can tell you this, and then I'll pass it on to Tripp. Doug, I remember the moment in October of 1998 in Glorieta, New Mexico, when I was sitting in the crowd at a conference you organized next to Danny Harrell, and the Mars Hill Band came on stage, and they played that Romans 12 song with the didgeridoo.
I remember that too.
It took me half an hour to find it, but I found it last night online.
Really?
And so like in episode 2, when I'm talking about my experience at Glorieta and hearing that, I'm like, there's a dude with a didgeridoo? What is this? What's going? What is happening?
That's a great phrase. There's a dude with a didgeridoo?
What is happening? It was a worship song like nothing I'd ever heard.
Yeah.
And I was like, this is different. There's something different. And so you can do that. You can explain that. You could ask me about that moment, and I could tell you about that moment.
Yeah, like we're doing now. Yeah.
Like we're doing now, but to then do it in a podcast where you can layer in music and emotion and stuff like that, that's been super rewarding.
Yeah. In a lot of ways, it's not a podcast by the typical sense of how we think about podcasts today. Like it's a produced audio experience, this thing, and sure, we deliver it. You're delivering it through the same mechanism. And, people don't even have iPods anymore, but we just have called it a podcast, for that purpose. But it is more than a podcast. This thing is an audio memory trail for people. By the way, have you reached out to Sky, the guy who led that band at Marcel? I keep up with him on Facebook. So if you need another interview.
Was that Sky Diamond? Was he?
This was a discussion in our text thread for Emerge last night, was finding this individual.
Yeah,
he didn't. I found the guy who wrote that song because it's like on his like Bandcamp Sight
Okay.
or whatever. The
Wow.
songs he wrote for the first Mars Hill Worship album that came
This is
out in
the didgeridoo master.
Oh my goodness, yeah. So Doug, I'll
The
send you the link. You
didgeridoo
can
dude. Oh yeah,
relive
no, I
old.
would love that. I remember that. I remember that experience as well. All right, so Tony, before we jump to Tripp on this question, um, for people who don't know, who weren't involved in the emerging church movement, right? So they don't know what the phrase Glorieta in 1998 means, which was a conference in New Mexico, in Glorieta, New Mexico. Have you had any experience of people who were not involved in the emerging church world listening to this, maybe editors or other people, and how does it strike them? Do you know,
Mm.
or do you have a sense about what that's going to feel like to people who, I don't know, listen to
Yeah,
a podcast with their spouse and who was into all this stuff and they don't know any of it? Do you know yet?
I'll tell you about one, and we got an email through our portal that anybody can leave us feedback through, and he's a pastor at a church you and I both know in San Diego, a progressive, kind of church planty type situation. And he wrote that by the time he graduated from high school, the emergent movement was over. So he felt like he missed it, but he still kind of read all the books, when he was in college and seminary, and tracked with the sentiments of the movement, even though he missed it in real time. So to listen to this first episode, which goes back to like way before the movement even started, what was happening in the church world in the 1980s and 90s. And frankly, for people who listen to your podcast and are part of your movement and in your community, I think because of in that first episode, we have a sociologist of American religion, Gerardo Marti, who talks at length about what was happening in the evangelical church in the late 80s and early 90s. And for people who are confounded about the state of evangelicalism today, I'd say one thing. I don't know that people like you and I could have predicted where American evangelicalism would end up, but we knew something was off and we tried to remedy it. This was a renewal movement in evangelicalism that did not work. But I think we saw something was going wrong in we were at least very disillusioned with the evangelical church, and not just the church, but the bigger institutions, the magazines and the seminaries and the foundations and the Christian colleges. And you and I had spent a lot of time with a lot of the leadership in those organizations, and we're very frustrated with the directions they were going. And we tried to change them.
Yeah.
Unsuccessfully. I mean, they went the way they went,
Yeah.
but I think so people who are unfamiliar, especially vote common gooders, might be like, oh yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting to see what was happening in the late 80s in the big seeker sensitive megachurch movement.
Yeah. Yeah. I sometimes I have this imagery that we were trying to change the path of a train, and the closest thing we could come up with was to derail it and get out and start walking. Like the train track
Or
was
uncouple our caboose.
Yeah,
and let the train keep going.
Just keep going, and then we're just sitting back here on the same damn track. That's a very real thing. In fact, I just want to say this now because I think I will forget if I don't. The conversations about epistemology and truth and how do we know what we know was so embedded in those conversations, and still are. Never would I have imagined that the religious right and the political right would capture postmodern deconstructive thought of truth and make it the core principle of Trumpism. And we were talking about this stuff 25 years ago and trying to say there's some benefit to not seeing truth the way that it was conveyed as a single notion. And the fears that we all had that people would just reconstruct truth into alternative facts and fake news and all that, it is just straight on out of those conversations that we were having. And some of the people who worried about all of us, in the deconstruction, I wonder if they're sitting around like, this is what I was talking about. That what the Trump MAGA movement does with information and data is the very thing that we were all afraid of, that you guys were saying there might be some possibility. And so anyway, at another time, I would love to have an ongoing conversation about how we see the play out in political spaces within the political right and the religious right that now have adopted. The people who critiqued us on the religious right about not holding to absolute truth now are full on that when it comes to election denialism and truth.
Yeah, but
everything else.
you're right, and it's on the other side too, because you hear that like, oh, this is the worst of postmodernism, but you also hear it from the right when they're like, oh, people on the left say like, oh, gender doesn't exist. That was just a social construct that was just made up. These are also
That's right.
very concepts that came out of the stuff we were trying to get our arms around.
No, we should totally have that conversation. All right. So Tripp, for you, and Homebrewed Christianity wanting to tell the oral history of the emerging church, you also are a practitioner in it. Like, you can't tell the story of emerging church without your impact, without Homebrewed Christianity's contribution. And in some ways, I feel like when people say, is anybody still doing that stuff you all were doing? This is one of the prime questions I think the podcast raises, is did it just go away, or has it become integrated into the rest of the system? When people ask me, hey, whatever happened to that old life you used to lead, talking to church leaders about this stuff, is anybody still doing that? One of the places I point to is your ongoing work with Homebrewed Christianity. But I've never asked you if you see it that way. Do you feel like your work with Homebrewed was always a part of that emerging church movement and conversation? And do you think it's a continuation of it, or how do you frame that up?
Yeah. Well, I guess a few things kind of come to mind. First would just be in Baptist circles in North Carolina, right when I was in divinity school, I was speaking about the role of friendship in the mission of God, right, at a ministers' convention. And someone comes up and is like, oh, that sounds like the emerging church thing. I didn't know you were a part of that. And I didn't really know what it was at that point. Google it, and, the connection gets made there. And that was before I had started the podcast. So that kind of like energy of the kind of early emerging church stuff that's coming, that's starting to spread out. Like, once I connected with it, there seemed a deep resonance, and then I met people like yourselves. And when the podcast started, there was always kind of a deep connection. If you go listen to the first 4 or 5 years, 80% of what happens is emergent related, not like just that y'all were on a lot, like a different emerging church people are on. But we used to do a call-in line, and other emerging church podcasters would come taunt us, and we'd interact. You and Tony came on in character, and from your rolling gospel revival van tour, which y'all clearly need to tell a cool story about on
RV
here.
tour.
That's
more than a van.
Yeah, that's what the common good
Not
podcast.
A bus tour.
No, a bus.
Not a bus tour.
It's an RV. It's an RV, and you can find out whether or not they had some roadkill dinners on that tour. But so early on, like, if you were keywording emerging church podcast or emergent village podcast, it was there, and it was just kind of like always a part of the podcast over time. And in the last 5 or 6 years, especially as more people get on podcasts, more people find it, people would go find old episodes, and I would get these messages. So what's the emerging church? And so part of doing the Emerge podcast is really to share with the, if there are like 50,000 people that listen to Homebrewed regularly, 2/3 of them didn't listen when that was like a regular thing on the podcast. And so doing this is also going like, this is what animated and inspired my faith. Like, why didn't I escape the church after our rather horrible response post 9/11, which was been the thing that kind of initiated my own faith deconstruction? It was finding a community of people that took the way of Jesus seriously, and it was centered in relationships and friendships and creative expression of it. And so I've served in mainline Protestant churches and all that kind of stuff, and teach theology and things. But the energy of the emerging church movement has always been a part of who I am as an adult, and so yeah, I'm more than happy to get labeled by you, Doug. More than happy.
All right. So the basic question that the podcast wants to address, at least in my memory, you can tell me if this is not one of the basic questions. Is the emerging church over with? Is it done? Is it in the past? When I was writing the headline for this live stream, I wasn't sure if I should write it in the past tense. What was the emerging church, or what is the emerging church? Okay, so you two. Emerging church was or is?
Well, I think it was. I think, and this is something that, Doug, when I interviewed you for the podcast, we talked about, and I've asked pretty much every guest, like, do you think the emerging church was a success or a failure? And we get a variety of answers to that. They're probably very much tied to that person's personality, whether they're a cynical old SOB like me, or an eternal Pollyanna optimist. We had a lot of different personalities in the movement. Probably no two more different than Brian McLaren and me, probably. But so we get different answers to that. People get real upset, frankly, when I say the emerging church was a failure.
Yeah.
But because they're like, no, it saved my faith. It saved my faith. So it's, you can tell your Viagra anecdote. But it didn't do what we wanted it to do.
Yeah.
And that was change the face of the church in America. Now, it maybe did a little bit around the edges. I think it influenced evangelicalism and it influenced mainline Protestantism.
Mm-hmm.
For sure. It influenced both of those streams of American religiosity, but it didn't change the direction the train was headed down the tracks, or it didn't keep the Titanic from hitting the iceberg.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, but I get the same response if I ever say that things that we were all up to didn't work. There are people for whom, and I've had to be more sensitive to that, because I think that people didn't know the plans that a bunch of us had for this. So they're like, all of a sudden now, 20 years later, you're telling me that you had this other agenda? I thought we were journeying together to a more fruitful way of collective life that worked. Now you're telling me this was a reconstructive effort, that you had this other agenda working in the back of your mind, which has been a real revelation to me, that like, oh yeah, at Solomon's Porch, the church that I worked at, I feel the same thing, that like, oh, I did have additional project in my mind of what we were doing with this thing that not everyone felt privy to, or even knew it was going on. They didn't even feel unprivied. They just didn't know at all. And then all of a sudden, 20 years on, they're like, oh, and you had another goal in mind? Like, it's like we were describing a road trip, and I'm like, but we never did get to Phoenix. They're like, I didn't know we were going to Phoenix. I thought we were just driving around. Like, so it's interesting to me. Tripp, how do you answer it? Was or is success not success, or do you use other categories altogether?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think people see it. Tony's right. Just in the interviews, people have very different answers. And I think temperament's a part of it. Also, probably what you thought you were doing, right? Like what you hear in the first episode, especially I think Tim Condor captures it well in that in the conversation with Tony, is that there was this assumption that after the success of baby boomer evangelicalism, that we need to figure out how to do it right for Gen Xers. And those of you that came out of the leadership network and stuff, Doug, and eventually a part of Emergent Village, kind of resisted a certain part of that legacy. But that element that a real evangelical, it deeply cares about the mission of God and that you should orient your life not just to figure out how to be faithful in your community, but to proclaim and invite and empower and encourage all these type of things, other communities of faith to do that in theirs. And that if you do it well, if you tell the good news, embody the good news in a compelling way, then goodness happens. And why would people be against if you baptized in to the body of Christ, Jesus is Savior, if you Lord, like if that's the case, then obviously you would want to figure out how to be faithful and deeply invested in your community, right? And that element that's there, that's part of American evangelicalism throughout. I think that the emerging church movement ran into a number of places that the community that kind of passed off that deep spiritual activism energy, it ran into places that American evangelicalism just wouldn't go. You know, early on, some of it was around different theological questions, like, how we see other religious traditions, or the boundaries of salvation, or how we engage postmodern philosophy, or exegete texts and interpret the Bible. There's that. And then over time, more and more different justice and political issues get on the table, or LGBTQ inclusion and these kinds of things. And that they may have made perfect sense for those that are a part of the emerging church conversation to host these questions, to start investing in these different issues. But that the kind of motherland of sorts where they got the energy, right, to really dig in to how they understand their faith and live it out, those places were like, no, I think we're going to
we got a little freeze
group over here.
Yep. Tripp, that's I think that's really insightful, and so on the money with what with what the project was. The thing I wonder is are we just dealing with classic movement life cycles? Like, how long can a movement last before it has to have enough reorienting new starting energy that it becomes something different? And the reason I think that matters is there's a really easy thing that we all do where something we're a part of that we know the history of it, and that can be an organization, that can be a movement, that can be Christianity, it can be Judaism, whatever. People will often say, like, well, we need to get back to what it was at the beginning. But that's not how any movement works. Movements come out of a certain set of experiences and a certain set of conditions. And then when those conditions change, it reforms itself. So it feels like, to me, the emerging church world fit really well somewhere from 1990 to 2010, 2015, maybe, somewhere in that world, 20 or 25 years. The set of conditions were really right for what we were all up to. And then over time, little bit by little bit, there's enough change where that set of conditions just didn't respond well to the things that we were all doing. And we were all changing. Like, I watched a lot of people just outgrow the emerging church themselves in their own life. Either their brand got bigger than the emerging church and they didn't want to be held back by it, or they just were changing in their faith, or they just didn't want to do it anymore, or life circumstances ended or changed. People's literal sexual identities changed, or their marriages ended. Like, real, just normal things that happen in people's lives kind of changed. And I've just wondered, maybe that's all this ever was. Any of the ending, like, there was no big reason. It's just change comes over a period of time, and something can only last, X number of years. Do you think that's a reasonable explanation for all this? Like, just how it goes. Yeah, things have a life, a shelf life to them, 12 to 20 years, maybe, something like that.
Do you think part of it is, groups and movements function are so tied to the ability for the leaders to embody and perform the identity. Obviously, the mediums in which that had changed over time, right? If you're thinking from the 90s through 2015. But also, if you just looked at so many of the leaders in the emerging church movement, where did the funding come from and where did they get health insurance? That changed dramatically in that time. In the early ones, we're hearing all this money coming in from the leadership network and this giant funding type thing to then by the end, Mike Clausen has a dissertation on church history dissertation on the emerging church movement. The amount of money everyone thought the leaders of the emergent village had putting on events and all this kind of stuff is like unrelated to its funding once evangelicals turned off the spigot, right? Think of how many people in the younger, the millennials of us that were involved in the emerging church movement get done with seminary, and you want to know where if you were a cohort leader and open and affirming and thought Moltmann was cool, where you could get a job that had health insurance at a mainline Protestant church. You're not getting funding for church planting with your evangelical denomination so that you can like start a new church and do gay weddings. Right, like there's so much that happened in that change that as a white evangelicalism got more and more tight on its boundaries, then the people whose faith came alive in the emerging church movement, if you're a leader and you're going and you're vocationally committed, you either have to find a place where you can get health insurance and pay for your student loans and all that kind of stuff, which tended to be mainline Protestant ones, or you go get a job outside of leadership. And I think that's like makes a huge difference. I have when I was in Edinburgh, I had a graduate student that worked on the American religious rights funding of clergy. So if you go look at how many conferences everything's paid for and who speaks and such in the kind of right-wing Christian nationalist circle, there are clergy who go to conferences, everything's paid for, they get training and all these kinds of things, and it's funded by very right-wing political groups that pay to rate, essentially support a whole leadership network of, that kind of vibe. That is not what happens in more progressive religious spaces. And then let's just imagine you're like, let's not use these identities. Let's hold space for disagreement and all the kinds of things that would happen in an emerging church cohort. That is not the thing that gets the kind of funding that I think plays a role very few people are aware of at shaping American religion. Even down to advertising funding at large, like in the social media space, it's like 30-1 for funding of any progressive religious advertising or stuff to more conservative. And that just wasn't the case in the emerging church movement. There was a time where you could hang out with people with very different identities, beliefs, and convictions, and the relationships were primary. And I don't think that's where we are today. I remember the decision of, do I want to get paid the most I've ever been paid and still have ever been paid by a liberal mainline Protestant church in LA, or do I want to plant a church where they'll give me $20,000 a year for 2 years?
Yeah. Totally. Look, Tripp, that you are on it. And one of the things I just want to say about the first episode of the podcast, it kind of made it seem like funding from a group called Leadership Network, where I worked, went to these churches, and it didn't. The Leadership Network never gave money to anything. It organized events at no cost for people, but that was it. Like there was no other. When I went to work for Leadership Network, I made less money. When I left being a youth pastor at the church that I was at, subsequently going to Leadership Network and then starting Solomon's Porch for 15 years, made less money in those entire 15 years than before that. It was no money grab. And Tony, I remember riding in the RV with you and talking about Barack Obama's election in 2008, if that was going to happen. And I remember us having a conversation that if we go to universal health care, where people don't have to pay for their health care out of their bank accounts, but it's covered at a federal level in taxes, that could be the thing that actually fuels the emerging church success. Because if people can take health insurance off their plate and the worry of that, they could then experiment in lots of creative things. That didn't happen. And I'm just say, Tripp, I'm giving an amen to your notion here that it was those just very basic things. If there was no infrastructure, and my friend who owns the progressive radio station here in Minneapolis, AM 950, the Progressive Talk of Minnesota, um, he told me that right-wing radio stations are completely funded by right-wing politics, by ad revenue that they pay through the political arm of the right wing. That's what funds conservative talk radio. It's not off of advertisers or anything. It comes directly from funding of the advertisers on the political side. Progressive talk radio gets no funding from the progressive side of politics. And I have a suspicion that conservative Christian radio is also funded by very specific people. And anything that's not conservative isn't funded by anybody.
Yeah.
And
Well,
this is
you
just
know,
a
Doug, the
bone
America
to
Fest-
pick with the world about this. If you want to know why
Uh,
conservatives exist, they're funded, and
Yeah,
progressives
well,
are not.
Charlie Kirk's big America Fest thing that was a few
Mhm.
weeks ago. I met someone since moving to North Carolina who went. He is a 26-year-old youth minister, and everything was paid for him to go.
Yeah.
And you know that in the last 10 years,
Yep.
everything Charlie Kirk's been doing, like, and he was a part of a cohort of 500 and some young clergy that went to this to basically get indoctrinated in Christian nationalism, and everything was paid for. If you're a 20-something-year-old minister at a church with 60 people in it, and somebody's going to fly you to Arizona, put you up in a nice hotel, give you spending money, and go hang out while you get indoctrinated, you know, like I said, you didn't find that a bit suspicious? Would they let you use the money for anything else? And he's like, well, you know, they just are trying to rally everyone around biblical truth, and I'm like, okay, but I just don't think people understand that money thing is a really big. It plays a really big role.
Okay,
anyway.
okay,
All right.
okay, but
We're gonna get Tony.
Okay,
really worked up.
curmudgeon.
Doug, I mean, I remember so many times we'd have erstwhile church planters show up on Sunday night at Solomon's Porch, and then you and I would kind of hold office hours at Original Pancake House. And my, you know, expertise was whatever, theology and postmodern thought or whatever. But you were actually just doing what these people all wanted to do. And I remember so many times you saying to these usually guys, why do you feel entitled to health insurance and a salary?
Yeah.
Like, you want to, they wanted to do something big with no risk.
Yep.
And the people who started churches in the movement took huge risks. You know, it's like the person who starts, it's like our friend Ann Kim, who started Pizzeria Lola on her credit card and is now a James Beard award-winning chef.
Yeah.
You know, she didn't, as you may recall, when she spoke at a conference for us when you had hepatitis, so you may not recall.
I do remember. I remember.
But she was told by everyone in the restaurant industry.
Let's be clear. It's the poop derivative, not hepatitis C.
You ate a baby's poop.
Clear.
You ate a baby's poop in Guatemala.
Yeah, it was.
We know.
Yeah, the baby's name was Abraham. I know who to blame.
She was told by people in the restaurant industry, if you want to learn the industry, you should start a Jimmy John's franchise and spend 10 years learning how to run a restaurant. And she was like, I mean, her James Beard award speech called F Fear, Fear is incredible. And that's what was in the blood of the people who were starting the movement, yourself included.
Yep.
Me to a lesser extent, but we all took huge risks. We did not have health insurance. We didn't have a steady paycheck. We hustled, you know, and that's, and I get, not everyone is wired to do that, you know, fair enough. Absolutely. Not everybody can do that. Not everybody has the, whatever, we're privileged because we're, you know, we come from some level of affluence. We have some kind of safety net around us that other people probably don't have. Nevertheless, it was a risky endeavor. And I do remember having that conversation with you about universal health care, because I mean, a lot of we knew it. We were meeting young pastors all the time who were
Yeah.
like, well, I'd love to, but if I leave my PCUSA pension.
Yeah.
And I mean, how am
Yeah.
I going to
I
live
guess
without
we sort
that?
of thought, well, maybe it was just solving the problem. Like, hey, if people could have more structure, but I think you're onto something deeper. People don't want to leave the safety. They want to climb with a harness on. And we were talking about free climbing.
Well,
And
Doug, how much do you find that in the political?
oh
There's
man,
everybody's like, yeah, our politics sucks. Money in politics sucks. Are you going to do anything about it? I don't know. I mean, it seems like a lot of work.
it's a lot of work. People do it all the time. When I'm like, hey, we're getting in the bus and we're going to start traveling. I watch people's faces go, oh, that's so much work.
It's like the rich young ruler went to Jesus,
Really?
went away sad.
A lot of work. Okay. Um, I was listening to watching a video about guitars, and there was this little excerpt from Taylor Guitars, a very now famous high-end brand. But the founder of Taylor Guitars started in 1974, said for the first 10 years until 1984, he and the other co-founder were not paid. They had to live off the charity of their families and bank loans building the company. They went 10 years without compensation. Now they're extremely wealthy. I only bring that up because that is not just in this industry. It's people from other industries, education or whatever, or just, manufacturing will tell these same stories over and over and over about the level of effort and risk and work that it is to make another railroad track, or to get off the railroad track and make another path, I don't know, a drone or something. And it usually doesn't come with, and what's the financial package that goes with, transformative movements? It's super risk taking. And so to that point, I'm like, look, the emerging church out hustled most other movements. Like, to my mind, maybe we didn't accomplish all that we wanted to, for sure. I have no problem saying we didn't accomplish what we wanted, so it's a failure, but it was also an enormous success in ways that we weren't counting. So that's sort of how life goes. And I don't think there's anything wrong with saying failure in one level and success in a whole other level. Tony referenced Tripp. I use this little illustration of Viagra. Viagra was started by people trying to solve heart disease and heart episodes. And they were trying to do things with the vascular system with some medication. It didn't do what they wanted in heart work, but did cause other benefits and become the number one selling drug in areas that was not what they intended. So they could declare it not a success, an experiment failure that had great financial reward in other areas. And I think that's just a good way to recognize how the world works. Sometimes the thing you're trying to do isn't successful. So let me spin this.
It's hard to call Viagra a failure. I think
Very hard
to call it a failure, Doug. You could
I
say
don't know what your level of
it emerged.
I don't know what your level of benefit is, but if you keep that in the drawer too long, I'm just saying it might not have the potency that you thought. It may be a time capsule release. So let me ask you this, and maybe we can wrap with this. How people get to the podcast and all that stuff, you can obviously tell us about. I already see people in the chat like, I had no idea any of this stuff was a thing, and super interested. What would be success for Emerged and Oral History of the Emerging Church Movement podcast? As you put all this time in, all this effort, you're not only releasing it, still working. Episodes are literally being made today. I bet there's somebody with their finger on a keyboard right now or moving a mouse around, making it happen. So it's in real motion. As you're sitting here on the 3rd of January, it launched 2 days ago, first episode. What will success look like for either or both of you with this podcast?
Go ahead, Tripp.
Well, okay. Two things. One, I would say success is for those of us that were a part of it. It gives you the opportunity to remember the different stories, voices, and such that really animated your life and faith at a moment in time. So for those that this is a part of their story, you'll be hearing parts you didn't know about. and that kind of thing, to reliving it. And we hope we do that well. The other part to me, and the thing I'm most animated about, is I hope the kind of energy of the movement can inspire people that are disgruntled and frustrated with the opportunities and institutional shape of faith to do some risking, and hopefully it'll invite more generative responses to the obviously frustrating elements of American religion, and not just inspire trolling, meme making, venting on the internet.
Wow.
That to me is the part of the emerging church movement I think is remains kind of inspirational to me. Is it a group of sharing intuitions, criticisms, frustrations, can bring something out that's more brings things out of it that are more than just venting and complaints, but community spaces, hosting relationships, and that kind of thing. I don't know if it will, inspire, a church planting movement or something like that, but I do think religious communities or communities of disciples will need to find new forms of gathering in community and such as things move forward, and telling the story of y'all and your friends and everyone that got tied up into it. Hopefully that'd be inspirational to someone. That'd be exciting.
Right.
And it took 9 years to get before I had 2,000 downloads of a podcast episode in the first day.
Yeah, nice.
And we did it. So I feel good about that.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great perspective. I sometimes think there is no way that the way we did the emerging church stuff in the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, could have worked in the current social media environment. Partially, I don't think people would have had the same felt need, but also the speed of criticism that we felt was fast on blogs and other places.
Books people wrote about us.
Books in the 2000s.
It came out so fast. Like, somebody wrote a book in 18 months about us. Like,
yeah.
Oh,
like, geez, how do we respond? Like, the idea that someone would meme make in real time during a conference and just
Doug, we used to
highlight our failures and collapse
Doug,
us
we
like
used
a
to
Jenga
run
tower.
a live Twitter feed on the big screen during events while we were speaking. Can you imagine doing that today? I mean, you couldn't do it.
Oh God.
Yeah, and that was 2000. That was like 2006 or 7 or 8, something like that.
Early Twitter, yeah, 8, 9, 10 in
those
there,
earliest
and like live Twitter
years.
feeds.
I mean, just like finding people. So it was so period specific, right?
Yeah.
And but I also say we took great pride in the fact that what it meant at Emergent Village, our insider language, to reference what you were saying earlier, Tripp, was built around friendship. And when Facebook launched, it launched with a notion of your connections are called your friends. That was the language we were using in the late 90s, early 2000s, because the same intuitions were in place. And the same reality that people found on Facebook, we found in our world, that people have really different definitions of friendship. Tony, what about you?
Well,
what would success look like?
I'd say two things. One, success. It happened in the first episode, and it happened magically, because it is not what we set out to when we were doing the interviews. When I was interviewing, I did most of the interviews for the first episode, and this question of the tension between Gen Xers and baby boomers in leadership of the church in the day.
Wow.
It's like, I didn't realize it came out in conversations with you and with Brad and with Tim Conder, and it was that little Breakfast Club comment that Tim Conder made, where all the pieces for episode 1 fell into place for me. And that is this: Rick Warren Rick Warren was one of the real successful pastors of the late 80s and early 90s, planted Saddleback Church, which was for a while the biggest church in America. And he had this idea of Saddleback Sam and Saddleback Sally, remember?
Mm-hmm.
And they were these kind of idealized Orange County mom and dad, and those were his targets to evangelize and get into his megachurch. We came along, and so the idea was that this population is monolithic. If we just tap, Doug, you and I remember back to the Young Life funnel model of youth ministry. Get the quarterback and the cheerleader to come to Young Life Club, and all the other kids in the high school are going to come to the Young Life Club. Then Breakfast Club comes along, a movie of our generation, and saying, no, look at these kids who are in detention on Saturday morning. They have nothing in common.
Right.
Like that's how, and so that came together in that episode kind of magically, like, oh my God, that was a big part of what was going on. And the disconnect between the baby boomer pastors who were like, okay, you Gen Xers, just figure out what Gen Xers look like and then bring them all in. And Gerardo Marty says it in the episode. He's like, faith is individualized. Everyone has their own experience of the Bible and Jesus and church. And the emergent movement was trying to take that into account, whereas the seeker-sensitive movement was treating everyone like they're cookie cutters. Yeah. So a success for me is if in every episode there's some kind of magic thread that comes through. And then the other thing is related to that.
Let me pause. I just want to put a point on that.
Yeah.
You're saying as the producer, you're hoping that episodes that are still coming together will have their own sync or their own kind of magical That's just fun for people who now listen to it to know that you're not saying that because maybe episode 2 is done. Is episode 2 done?
No, not done yet. No.
Okay. So this is in such real time, these produced podcasts, that you're still hoping that they have a coherence that is more than what you ever imagined the parts to be. So I think that's fun for people to listen to them and say like, oh yeah, that actually happened. And you and Tripp and other producers didn't know that was, that's not guaranteed. That may or may not happen.
Right. And it's, I think the benefit of having multiple voices in every episode, because things can kind of come together and then you edit it and tell a story. So that's part of it. And then the other thing, Doug, I would just say is like, even though it wasn't, even though we push back against this generational idea, and we obviously had people like, most notably Phyllis Tickle and Brian McLaren, who aren't of our generation, Gen Xers, who were a really, really big part of it. Nevertheless, the emergent movement was kind of the Gen X moment in the church. And Doug, our generation, man, we may never have a U.S. president. Like, U.S. presidents may skip Gen Xers. It may go straight from a old boomer to a millennial,
Biden to Buttigieg, and we're not even.
It might. You know what I'm saying? Like our generation.
Don't scare me, Doug.
Generation X was small. We're small, and
smaller,
we have our own kind of cultural idioms and stuff like that. In the church world, I think it's nice to build this podcast project and have this little like kind of treasury
classic
of the Gen X moment. When we tried to really do something in our 30s that was really fun, very special for a lot of people, but I don't want that to be lost. So putting this together, that's a success for me, is like at the end, we're like, oh, I'm glad that's out there for people to listen to, forever.
Well, what I think look, if the two of you and your producer, Josh, hadn't said yes to this, there wouldn't be this oral history. It would just go down, somebody would dig up Mike Lawson's, doctoral work, or they'd stumble on some books or have to go back and reconstruct it, listening to Homebrewed Christianity podcasts or something, and it would just be gone. The future is made by the choices of a very select group of people in any line of the future, right? Automobile, whatever it is, the future is being made in lots of little pieces by very small numbers of people making choices inside their own areas of influence. And listening back to this podcast, I was sort of reminded of that feeling. It's quite possible there could have never been anything like the emerging church movement, save for 25 people's individual choices to say yes to something, like so small. And that's just true across movements, I think. And one can lose their mind thinking about what could have been had one or two happenings been a little bit different in the world, or what may have never been had someone not randomly said yes or stumbled onto something like that. Very small impact. So I could imagine a success coming out of this, that someone hears it and it becomes part of their backstory that just compels them off to do and to make something, which I would really like. My greatest regret in all of this is I just feel like there's not a direct descendant line of all this emerging church stuff. Like, it just surprises me that, I don't know, whatever the next generations after Gen X are, Ys or millennials or Zs or whatever, aren't really doing anything similar. And maybe I've just missed it, but I hear every once in a while that some things come along, but I don't know, it doesn't take many. Are there, there's very biblical, very, Jewish scripture, biblical narrative to all of this. Like, hey, we just need 10. Can we get 10? We get 10 faithful people that'll go do a thing. Like, we could probably make some magic if we get 10. So I don't know, maybe this thing, how many people will end up listening to this? Do you know already? Do you have numbers? Do you have any of that? Are there commas in it? Are there 2 commas, 1 comma, no commas? How many listeners are we talking about?
Well, I guess we passed over 2,000 in the first, day and a half. So
Really?
there we go.
Great.
That's where we are.
For a
right now.
non-existent podcast that, doesn't have any push, that is great. Is there going to be advertising? I feel like I heard in the first one there was like a pause. We'll be back after the break. And then it was like I'd paid for the subscription to not have to listen to ads.
Well,
will there be ads in future episodes?
They're ads in the middle if your IP address is something
an advertiser wants.
An advertiser wants. Tony was worried because there wasn't any in his experience, and apparently you also did not get an ad.
None.
But don't worry, there are desirable people that listened that were delivered ads. But
really,
yeah.
So we should also say, Doug, that if people go to emergedpodcast.com,
okay,
they can sign
Great
up
website
for
emergedpodcast.com
for a donation of anything, including 0 to as no upper limit, and they'll get access to ad-free episodes, extra full-length interview episodes, the live stream between episodes where we break down the episode that's just aired. We're doing one next week. We're going to do them with different people all throughout the run of the show. You can get an Emerged mug. You can get an enamel pin. There's other, at your different levels. So, if people like it, they can join. Kind of, it's a crowd-funded project, and people can join, and they can opt out of those ads for $1 of a donation.
So emergedpodcast.com is the best place to go. And then there's Facebook groups if people use that platform and all the rest of it.
Yep.
Yes.
Well, congratulations on this. It's great. It's the best produced podcast that I have personal connection to. So it feels very like, well, look what my friends were able to do. I mean, this is S-Town level. Well, by the way, Tony, I know we both like S-Town, that podcast. And for people who are not familiar with that, worth listening to.
And more
Did that
tragedy.
Inspire you at all in this?
More tragedy has come out of that story because another guy from that story died last month. But
it's almost like everybody dies. It's just crazy how it feels sometimes.
Isn't it funny? It just keeps happening. Yeah, all those kind of produced podcasts, Serial, what's the one from Minnesota, the one about Jacob Wetterling,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
All those, and of course the rise and fall of Mars Hill from Christianity Today, which was such a huge hit. along some of the same kind of things. But
Yeah.
anyway,
Okay.
yeah, those there is a way of that. We're not the first ones to do a podcast like this, but we're learning quickly how much work it is.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, congratulations. I hope people in this
Thanks
stream
for
listen
having
to
us.
it and share it with a friend or two. Don't be selfish with your goodness, friends. Send this in text
Please
messages to
share it.
somebody. Like, just pick a random person in your contact and send the podcast link and say, "Hey, I think you'd enjoy this." Just
Yeah.
don't even worry about who it
Please.
is. Just send it to somebody and see what happens. Somebody starts listening. They're like, "What? Why am I? Who are these people? And what is this? What is this thing?" All right. Any last words for us? Anything we should tell these good people about?
I just really want y'all to get in character when we do the live stream on Monday from your basement. I want a reprisal from your RV tour. So it was an RV.
The RV, that very vehicle that we traveled in 2008 on the Rolling Gospel Revival Church Basement Roadshow, that very vehicle will actually be at this house on that day. We could do this whole thing from that RV.
Oh gosh.
Whoa. I'm just saying it, dear listeners.
This could get very meta.
If you go to emergedpodcast.com and donate $1, you too can see if Tony and Doug reprise was it your grandfather that you played in the story?
Yeah, I'm gonna need some Pathos punch if I'm gonna share an RV with Doug again.
Well, I can make a punch. I don't know if it's Pathos, because I don't know how to make a punch with that many pop-up ads in it. But
there's a
inside
deep cut.
jokes.
There's a deep cut humor.
We're going deep in inside jokes here. Yeah.
Pathos pop-up ads. We thought they were bad on that Pathos website until you now open anything on an iPhone and it's just in apps and everything. It's just constant pop-ups. All right. Well, you fellows will pop up over here, and thanks all for being a part of the podcast.
Thanks, Doug.
And we'll